All right, so this is going to be several different sections of lecture notes over the skeletal system, which is chapter 4. As I've said a couple of times in class, that this is the first chapter where we're going to have some physiology involved. So we tend to see the difficulty kind of ramp up when we get to the physiology, and just there's a lot of vocabulary in this unit, and it just in general this is where we start to see the difficulty increase in the course compared to chapters 1, 2, and 3. So let's start with just some general facts for this PowerPoint concerning the skeletal system. So it's made of two main components, obviously our bones, which are connective tissue, specifically osseous tissue, that we can see over here on the right. And I didn't focus too much on the word osseous with chapter 2, just strictly because we were trying to scratch the surface on that. So that's technically the name of the tissue that makes up bones. Cartilage that we can see here on the left, and that's just one type of cartilage that we're seeing. It's the other main component of the skeletal system. We've already talked about the fact that they both have lacuna with living cells within those spaces. So the chondrocytes and the lacuna are easily visible on the cartilage. And then it just looks like the little black dots, right, around the concentric rings of bone or osseous tissue on the right, with the osteocyte within the lacuna there. Bones in general are really strong but light in weight, which is why it's pretty easy for us to move around on a daily basis. Bone is a dynamic tissue, and if you don't know the vocabulary word dynamic, it's a great vocabulary word to know. The ACT uses it heavily. And it just means changing, and it's just a good kind of everyday vocabulary word. So that being said, bone grows and degenerates. It's constantly broken down and reformed. It heals following injury. In general, we say that no bone is more than about 20 years old. So if we look at my age, I'm 44, and that means that I'm in the very beginning of my third round of bones. So mine have been reformed once, essentially by the time I was 20, another time by the time I was 40, and so we're in the beginning of what will be my third round of bone formation. You guys are toward the end of your first round, okay, of making new bone. Bones have physical differences, which I'm sure we're all already aware of. We'll talk more about that with some additional things that aren't just, shape and location. Each bone is considered a separate organ, okay, and so let's look at some major functions of the skeletal system on this next slide, and then the one after that. So we've already discussed that the skeletal system supports our body, its framework, okay, protects internal organs. You've got some specific examples there, the skull protecting your brain, your ribs protecting your heart and lungs. And then we've already talked about the fact that the skeletal system, each bone is going to act as a lever, that when muscles contract, they're going to pull on those bones to allow you to move. And now we're going to pull in tendons and ligaments. So tendons that we can see here on the left, they are going to bind muscle to bone, as you see on the diagram. So we'll talk about that again in the muscular system. And then ligaments are going to attach bones to each other at a joint. So this particular diagram, this is all the ligaments within your wrist, okay, around your carpals. This set of ligaments right here, that's what we would think of as our knuckles. Okay, so these bones, those are the bones that make up the palm of your hands. Okay, so that's your carpals in your wrist. Then these are called your metacarpals. And again, that would be like your knuckles. And then all these little bones out here, your phalanges, make up your finger bones. Okay, so when you're wiggling your fingers, the joints that we see here, that's what you're able to move. Let me pause for a second. All right, so bones store and release minerals, specifically in the form of calcium and phosphorus, and we'll talk about that a little bit more eventually too. Those two elements are needed for muscle contraction and nerve activity and blood clotting. So again, when we're talking about each separate system, we're going to pull back to the skeletal system at some point and say, remember that bones store calcium and phosphorus when we are talking about nerve impulse conduction or clotting of blood, for example. Bones are going to store energy. Specifically, they're going to store energy in the form of lipids, right, which remember are long-term energy storage molecule within the yellow marrow of our bones. It's a really lipid-rich substance. If we see here this wolf, for example, that's eating on this, if that's, I don't know, I think it's just a deer, carcass, that when they get into bones and get into the middle of the medullary cavity, which we can see here, okay, and that's the location within a bone, where yellow marrow is located, then they're getting to that lipid-rich marrow, yellow marrow specifically, so that they can eat that and have a long-term energy storage molecule that they're taking in, okay? Bones are going to produce blood cells, right? So notice it says all blood cells form in a part of the bone known as the red marrow, and red marrow is in the regions that are considered what are called spongy bone. We'll get to the different types of bones eventually, or bone, there's 2 different types. And it forms through a process called either hemapoiesis or hematopoiesis. And notice those are pretty much almost the same word. You're just adding the the TO for hematopoiesis. Doesn't matter which one you give me as an answer, as long as you can recognize both and give me one of them. And you do have to be able to spell those. And they are interchangeable. Okay, so that's red blood cell production that's going to occur in the red marrow. All right, so we've already talked about the fact that osseous tissue or bone is the hardest connective tissue in the body, but it can actually bend under weight. Okay, so we'll talk about dispersion of forces along the length of a long bone, for example, especially when you're talking about somebody that's huge like Yao Ming. The first fact that's up there, so bone makes up about 15 to 20% of our total body weight. Remember, skin was about 7%. Okay, about 2/3 of our bone is made of calcium phosphate. That's the chemical formula for that. Calcium phosphate's strong, but it's not flexible. And then about 1/3 of our bone is made of collagen, which, as we've already talked about, is tough and flexible. Okay, and then the osteocytes and the other cells that make up bone, they're only about 2% of the total mass of a bone. Okay, so adding to that about the calcium phosphate and the collagen, so it's really, really strong and it's slightly flexible when we combine those 2 tissues together to, again, make it the hardest connective tissue in the body, but that it can bend under stress. All right, so bones are also, they're highly vascular, right? So they are going to have nutrient arteries that are going to deliver oxygen and nutrients to the bone tissue, and then a nutrient vein that's going to drain, as far as just kind of looking at this diagram over here, that's showing the nutrient artery, but they're going to have veins that are going to drain the blood supply that's full of waste products, carbon dioxide and other metabolic wastes from the bone, so highly vascular. This section here about the periosteum, that's part of bones being highly vascular. So this is the part of the picture that's just showing the cutaway of the periosteum here. So it's a layer of connective tissue that surrounds the bone, loaded with blood vessels, nerve fibers, and then also stem cells. We'll talk about that definition in just a second. The periosteum is essential for bone nutrition, growth, and repair. Essentially, if a bone were to somehow lose the periosteum through damage or disease, then that whole bone is often going to die. Okay. Hopefully you recognize the term stem cell, but if you don't, stem cells are cells that have, at the time, no specific end product as far as the type of cell that they're going to become. Okay, so the periosteum's loaded with stem cells that are going to turn into actual bone cells, right? And we're going to stop there for this video. Let me know if you have any questions.